when we get to be older and hopefully a little more mature, we may or may not be engaged in reading novels or short stories or watching the telenovelas on TV, the miniseries about this or that particular kind of theme. We love to get lost in stories. So another aspect of stories is that they take us away from our reality that is, so palpable and so real and so physically manifest. So I was thinking that also would be something for us, as we're all sort of cooped up now and our physical world has become very, very constrained, to be able to take leaps in our imagination to other worlds, to other times, to be with other people, I thought would be something that would be valuable for us, and perhaps a little bit of a consolation, and hopefully also a stimulation. I'm going to pause for a second again, and if anybody wants to unmute and say a comment or say something, share with us, that would be great.
Another technical thing, we're recording this meeting, so everybody should know that it's being recorded, so that we can put it on the YouTube channel for other people to listen to later.
Right. Thank you, John. Thank you. I'm incorrigible. All right. Does anybody want to chime in at this point before we get into the next story?
The 3 spots.
I did want to say something about stories, since it's what I do for a living, basically.
Absolutely. Good.
I guess that's
everything
is speaking without talking to us. If you're speaking to somebody else, please mute.
So everything's a story. We have this. We live by stories. The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. We're writing our own stories by living. Everything is a story. Everything we do on the stage is a story. Everything. It's the only thing we really experience is some kind of story.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important point. And yet there is a little bit of a difference between everything that we're doing and stories per se. Even with the modern kind of stretching of stories in terms of form and in terms of format and so on, generally speaking, a good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And our lives don't quite have that kind of clean-cut format. Yes, we're born, and then we live, and then we die. So there's beginning, middle, and end. But those beginnings, middles, and ends are really not the same kind of satisfyingly coherent connection from one to the next that we find in a story. Stories give us the experience of making sense of a line of life, right? We live our lives in this temporal line from the moment of our birth, and then we just keep on going, whether we like it or not. But we don't necessarily feel that temporal line makes sense. In a story, even if it's a mysterious story or it's a story about people who we don't quite understand, the story holds up as a coherent whole. And I think that it speaks to a yearning on our part to make sense of these ongoing stories that are there all the time. As I'm speaking, the story is rolling along. So there's that aspect as well. Thank you. We're in a time now when things don't necessarily make sense at all. So having a few momentary moments of crystallized meaning can also be refreshing and perhaps consoling.
I'd like to talk about stories. It's Dale Russakoff.
Thank you.
I agree completely with what Rabbi Greenstein said at the beginning about how the story kind of primes us to understand maybe bigger things, maybe more technical things. It's my business, like John, is stories. I'm a journalist. My husband is an editor. Matt Purdy is an editor. And I'm thinking of all the stories that I'm reading now about the coronavirus and the stories that are about just individual people and their struggle to get by. The people who, are going to work in hospitals and exposing themselves every day, and what that is like, just looking around and seeing all the things and the people and the equipment that might have a diseased cell on it. The woman who wrote today about taking care of her husband who has the virus, and he isn't even in the hospital, so he's supposedly a mild case, but it sounds like he's in a life or death struggle every night, and so is she, and so is her 16-year-old daughter, and they're just full-time trying to keep him, breathing and alive. I just feel like knowing all of this does more for me than any of the statistics coming out of the CDC or the state of New York or anything, just understanding the human struggle that's going on. And I even am thinking of a couple of days ago when Dan Silver and his wife had a virtual baby naming because, of course, they couldn't have a gathering at their home. And they told stories about the people whose names the baby was given to carry on into the future. And, we said prayers, we said blessings, we did all the traditional things, and those are all meaningful. But having this particular child's life and the stories of the people who his names came from gave so much more meaning to the things that we do every time there's a bris. And I just feel like stories for me just make me feel just more in touch with the world. And particularly here we are isolated in our homes. This is a real sense of connection that we can get.
The rabbi seems to have inadvertently dropped out of the meeting, so hopefully he'll be back in a second.
7 spots.
So I'll talk then, just because we're waiting for the rabbi to come back. This is Fern. And, how I also look at stories, because I use them professionally all over the world. Even though in business, stories also a way of showing that we are all not that different. That, it's funny, as I do have friends literally all over the world and colleagues, as many of you know, and I have been connecting with people in Slovakia and people in Vienna and Sydney, Australia. By the way, Megan and Emil say hello to everyone. And hopefully I'll be getting JJ's most updated picture shortly, and I'll be sending it around. But, in this trying time, whether, I keep saying for better, for worse, we are all going through a version of the same story right now. There is no one in this world that has an exception to that. Our stories are going to be, I always believe in the 80-20 rule. 80% we're all the same, 20% there are differences. I think that when we compare stories, and even as I'm comparing stories every day with friends in different countries, 80% we're all going through the same thing. And then 20% we have our own little individuality going on it. So stories also connect us.
And then
it is interesting, isn't it, that this is sort of the first, global event I've ever experienced. That, even I don't even think even the world wars were simultaneously felt in the same way. As this is an event that everybody, everywhere, is feeling.
One of them looks like
John, I can tell you absolutely, because I'm not kidding. I have spoken to a different person in a different country almost every day for the last 10 days. And it's absolutely a global event. There is not a single person I know in a single country. And I probably, it's been a lot. Everyone is going through this right now. And even, I hate to say it, but 2 or 3 weeks ago, when people were like, well, that's over there. And I'm listening to my friends who've already been under quarantine restrictions. And Vienna shut down a couple of weeks ago, and Prague shut down before Vienna and whatever. And I'm saying, what makes us think it's not coming here? And that was, for me, just in listening to Americans and people on the news and whatever, that's somewhere else across the border. It's not. We're all going through this, and we're all going to have our story.
Hi. I just want to thank Dale for mentioning the virtual baby naming. Am I on? People here from
You're
Maryland?
on. You're on.
Okay, great. We were going to add that comment, so thank you, Dale, for getting there first. I just want to say about our new grandson's name, Isaac. He's named for my Uncle Irving, and my Uncle Irving died before Daniel was 1 year old. We kept him alive with his stories. And, sometimes you think, oh, your kids say, oh, not that story again, or they're not listening. Apparently, our son listened to those stories for over 30 years, and the stories of my uncle's life made an impression of him on him without him actually physically knowing him. And that gives us a lot of strength and a lot of hope.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I had some kind of technical problem. Dale froze in the middle of her speaking, and I didn't hear any of what she said. Just her introduction that she was a storyteller and talking about the virus and the stories. So I missed that, and I got back in the middle of Fern's speaking. So I thank you for that. So I hope I didn't miss too much. Yeah, I think that we're finding out how much we're intertwined and how much our stories interlock with each other. But of course, it's an interesting thing when the sameness is what's interesting and when the difference is what's interesting. I think usually we're interested in the difference. Right. And when we're, just going about our business and we take for granted so much that we now no longer can take for granted. One of the things that we take for granted is our being connected to each other and the fact that we're all basically the same. And that's not interesting. What's interesting is a different story. We're looking for something that's, a little out of the ordinary or a little not, out of my own experience. And now it's so, I think it's powerful to feel that sameness, that connection, that overlap. It breaks through a lot of our sense of isolation. Good. With your permission, we're going to now I'm going to share with you a story, and then we can, again, stop and talk. This is a story from the Zohar. The Zohar is the central classic text of the Jewish mystical tradition. It was produced at the end of the 1200s in Spain, but it talks about life as if it were part of a community from over 1,000 years earlier. And it talks about life in the land of Israel at the time of the sages who were creating Rabbinic Judaism. So it's a book of teaching, but it uses stories all the time. And the fact that it presents itself in this kind of fake place and time makes the whole thing a big story. But in the book, along with some very profound and difficult and moving and inspiring mystical teachings, we have again and again and again stories. So here's one story. Rabbi Acha traveled to Kfar Tarsha. He arrived at his inn. All the town's residents spoke in hushed tones about him, saying, "A great man has arrived here. Let's go see him." They went to him and they said to him, "Is the master's heart anguished by the destruction?" They talk to him in the third person, and they're asking whether Rav Acha's heart has been pained by the suffering that they're experiencing. What's he doing here? How did he get here? And he said to them, "What do you mean?" So he did not come because he was on a mission to try to help this town. He came by coincidence, and now he first hears what's happening in the town. They said to him, "For 7 days, a plague has been hovering over the town. Each day it grows stronger, and it does not stop." He said to them, "Then let us go to the synagogue and beg for mercy from the Holy Blessed One. While they were walking, some other people arrived and said, so-and-so and so-and-so have died, and so-and-so and so-and-so are at the brink of death. Rabbi Yacha said to them, now is not the time to stand by. The hour is pressing. Rather, set aside 40 of the most righteous people in 4 groups of 10, and I along with you. 10 for one corner of the town, 10 for another corner of the town, and so on for the 4 corners of the town. And then each recite with soulful devotion the passages of the aromatic incense, the Ketoret, that the Holy Blessed One gave to Moses, and accompany them with passages of the sacrifices. And they did so 3 times. And they passed through all 4 directions of the town, reciting accordingly. Afterward he said to them, now let us go to those verging on death. Set aside other righteous people for their houses, and let them recite in a similar fashion. When you finish, recite these verses loudly 3 times. Moses said to Aaron, take the incense fire pan and place fire upon it. And Aaron did so. And he stood between the dead and the living, and he halted the plague. And they did so. And the plague ceased. And then they heard a voice from heaven saying, secret striker, primal striker, wait on high. The judgment of heaven no longer hovers here, for they below know how to nullify it. Rabbi Acha's heart was faint. He fell asleep, and he heard that they were telling him, just as you accomplished that, now go and accomplish this. Go and tell them to return in tshuva, for they have been wicked before me. He arose and he returned them in complete tshuva, and they accepted upon themselves never to leave the Torah. And they changed the name of the city to Mata Mechasya, the place of protection. So that's the story of the Zohar. It's a story of plague. It's a story of suffering, of people dying, and of people being on the verge of dying. And it's a miracle story. And it's a story that harkens back to ancient stories that came before it. And what it tells us is about a sage who happens to be at the wrong place at the right time. And in order to help the people, he adopts certain strategies. His first strategy, what is it? What is his first strategy? What's the first thing that he does when he hears that the town is in trouble? Anybody remember? He says, let's go to the shul. Let's go to the sanctuary and let's pray. Let's pray for mercy. And as he's going in this kind of standard conventional way to try to confront the trouble, he starts hearing about the urgency of the matter. He starts hearing, here's another case. Here's another case reported. Here's somebody who just passed away. Here's somebody who's on the brink of death. And then he turns around and he says, forget that. We're not going into the synagogue right now and praying as we always do. Instead, we have to go out into the town and encompass the town. and he gets 4 minions going. 4 minions at each of the directions, north, south, east, west corners of the town. He surrounds the town with these 4 minions, and he instructs them to do a very, very particular thing. And that is, he tells them, recite the portion in the Torah that talks about the incense offering. And if you do that, then hopefully the plague will be halted. And they do. They do the recitation of the Torah portion about the incense. We had it a couple of weeks ago. And as a result, the plague ceases. But it doesn't cease and then everything just goes back to normal. There are still people who have become sick and who are on the brink of death in their beds. And then he says, now we have to go to each one of them. We have to go to each one of them and recite the Ketoret again, and then recite the verses that tell about how I got this idea. And then when you do that, hopefully that will work for those people who are still sick. And it did. And by that time, he's exhausted. By that time, he's completely drained. He collapses in sleep. Oh, and of course, one port before that, here they all hear a heavenly voice, and the voice addresses the angel of death. And it says to the angel of death, back off. You no longer have permission to take any one of the people in this town because they have bested you. They have fought back and they have defeated you. They know how to stop you in your tracks. So go away. So the heavenly voice pushes the angel of death away. And that's when he says, I've had it. And he goes into a deep sleep and has another dream. And in the dream, he hears God, the heavens, say to him, you did your work. You saved the lives. You physically helped this community. And now you have to get the community spiritually to heal. They have to be able to return back to me. And then the very end of the story is, and he did. He did. And as a result, this town, which was called Kfar Tarsha, which means the village of the clod of earth, became the famous village of Mata Machasya, which was one of the rabbinic academies, and it means the place of protection. So that's the story. I want to get to, if we have time, I think we will, what this incense business is all about. But if anybody wants to chime in now with whatever, comments, questions, insights you have about what you heard, I'm inviting people to unmute one at a time. So please, anybody want to join in?
I like that he practiced social distancing.
That he practiced what?
Social distancing by heading to the corners of the town rather than in
Right.
smaller groups, rather than everybody going to the synagogue.
Or everybody going into the town square together and having a mass meeting or something
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
Right. Interesting.
It's
I don't-
Eileen.
Would we have ever thought of that, 2 months ago? I don't know.
No.
Can I say something, Rabbi? Can you hear
Sure.
me? It's Carol.
Yes. And I can see you.
Okay. My 2.5-year-old great niece on Monday dressed herself. And she has shoes that she wears just to go to shul on Shabbos. So my nephew said to her, why are you putting on your Shabbos shoes?
Uh-huh.
And her response was, we have to do it for later, because that's when we're going to shul, because I put on my Shabbos shoes, so we're going to shul. So from a little one, there's hope. I
Right.
wanted to share that.
She sees into the future and she has hope,
Yep.
right? And she can teach us to keep that hope alive.
And she wants to
Absolutely.
be ready.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
It's Eileen. I'd like to say something. Can you hear me?
Sure. Yes.
I think one of the important things is that instead of following the old ways, he thought outside of the box and he became a leader and did what needed to be done to solve the problem.
Right. He had to improvise a little bit and do something much more urgent and immediate. Right. Anybody else?
Hi, it's Leila. Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Can you see me? I can see you all, but
You look like a green dot with an L in it.
yeah, I don't know how to make it. I don't know.
On the bottom of your screen, there should be a picture of a movie camera. When you take your cursor, your arrow, and you bring it down to your screen, it gives you a bunch of things.
I don't see any bunches of anything.
One is it comes up. It's a white band and it has meeting details, and then it has a microphone icon, and then it has a telephone icon, and then it has a camera. Maybe you don't have a camera.
Yeah, it's on, but now it's a good thing because you can't see me. I'm wearing Potiphar is wearing no clothes, so it's a good thing you can't see me. Ha ha.
Okay, that's an interesting story right there. Go ahead.
So I just it's a lot of meat to digest, and thank you so much for doing this, and I'll think on it, and I will think of something to share. And it's so nice to see all of you. Love you. Be healthy, okay?
Great to hear your voice.
Thank you.
So anybody else?
Hi, I just wanted to say something. It's Meredith Lopez.
Hi.
Hi, I'm also a writer and I love stories, and I tend to write pretty dark and horror stories, and I also study them. And one of the things that I've noticed is that dark stories, and even stories like the one you just told us, they always give us hope. There's always something to overcome, something terrible, something seemingly unbearable, but we overcome it. And I've noticed that a lot of people in my community are turning right now to movies and books about plagues and apocalypses and the end of the world. And the reason they're doing that is not to be like ghouls or for some sick satisfaction, but because all of these stories show us that no matter what, humanity is going to persevere and overcome.
Yes, I think so. When we're surrounded by this very frightening reality that we can't wrap our minds around, forget about, touch and hold on to, taking a catastrophe that you can actually hold in your hand, a little story or a little book, it makes it literally handleable. So yeah, I think that that's a very powerful good that engaging in this kind of stuff can do for us, and we shouldn't dismiss it as being kidding ourselves. This is not fantasy. This is real. To hold on to that sense of manageability and to hold on to that sense of hope that Geraldine was mentioning before, this is key. This is not hallucination. This is survival strategies. This is what we need to be doing. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Next, anybody else?
I wanted to say that I've been following this for a long time, and I've been watching people's personal blogs on YouTube, like video blogs of usually expats who are in China. I watched it through the whole time that it was really bad in China, and they were doing what we did. They were, talking from their quarantine places in their homes, and what's now interesting and nice, actually, it's really died off in China. There's really not. They only added like 4 cases or something yesterday in the whole country. But when I watch now, it's all opening up again. So there are people going out in the streets, and there was a they did a shot of nurses in front of a hospital, all taking off their masks. It was very moving, but that's a story that's turned out to be very nice, that when I feel really down, I kind of just look to those to see what the future phase will be. We're in the dark time now, but eventually we'll be like they are, taking the masks off again. Not that we had any to begin with.
Amen, amen, amen. So I want to go back to that key element of this story, which is that the magic formula, the silver bullet that Rabbi Acha pulled out of his sleeve was not something that he invented. He copied an ancient story. And it's alluded to in the story when he says, when we go to the bed of each person who's still sick, we have to mention the verses from that story. So let me tell you that story, which is the background for this story. It comes from the book of Numbers, the fourth book of our 5 books of Moses. And the story has a very famous beginning and middle, but not necessarily a famous ending. It's the ending that we'll get to. The famous beginning is the beginning of Korach, who is Moses' cousin, who sets up a rebellion against Moses' leadership and against Aaron, and tries to become the leader of the Israelites. And he, challenges Moses, what have you ever done for us? People have very short memories. We know that. So Moses says, you know what? Let's have a test. Let's have an election, so to speak, but with only one voter. God will be the voter. Let's see if God will vote for me or God will vote for you. And how we'll do this is that Aaron will bring incense to the tabernacle and you will bring incense to the tabernacle. I'm simplifying the story a little bit. And we'll see whose incense pan is zapped and accepted by heaven. And of course, it's Aaron's, but the other incense pans that Korach and his cohort of 250 rebels bring, they're all assaulted by fire, and everybody dies, and then Korach and his people get swallowed up by the earth, and that's the end of the rebellion. So clearly, it's a definitive result. There's no challenging it in the Supreme Court. It's not an electoral college kind of problem. It's clear Moses and Aaron have been called by God. And that's the beginning and the middle part of the story that people are a little familiar with. This is the way the story then continues. This is chapter 17 in the book of Numbers. But on the next day, that means the day after this whole thing settled down, the earth had opened up and closed over Korach and his rebels. The next day, all the congregation of the people of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. And they said, you have killed the people of the Lord. So the people now are so upset that they're saying, look at you, Moses and Aaron, look at what you have done. Korach and his people have been killed by the earthquake or the sinkhole or whatever you want to call it, and by the incense pans being burnt up. How dare you? And it came to pass when the congregation was gathered against Moses and against Aaron, that they looked toward the tent of meeting, and behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Eternal appeared. And Moses and Aaron came and stood before the tent of meeting. And the Eternal spoke to Moses and said, get away from among this congregation, so that I can consume them in a moment. Moses and Aaron fell on their faces. And Moses said to Aaron, run, take an incense censer, put fire in it from the altar, put in the incense, go quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them. For anger has come out from the Eternal, and a plague has begun. And Aaron did as Moses commanded, and he ran into the midst of the congregation. He's holding the incense in the incense pan, and it's burning. And behold, the plague had begun among the people. He put on incense and made an atonement for the people, and he stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stopped. So it turns out that Rabbi Acha's stratagem was based on this story. But there's something that connects those two stories with the very, very first story that I told. Does anybody see the connection? What's the common denominator, of course, is the incense. And we have to get back to understanding why that incense worked. But what's the connection? What's the difference between the story in the Torah and actually what happened in the story with Rav Acha and those villagers? Anybody notice that a key difference?
Well, this is Bill. The plague in the Torah story was sent directly by God. It's quite clear. He did that as a punishment. In the case of Rav Acha and the people in his village, it's not clear. It's not stated. They're sick, but we don't know where the sickness came from. There's no apparent implication that it's punishment for anything. They just got sick. That's the one difference that I see.
So I think that's not quite accurate, because by the end of the story, we have the heavenly voice saying that this is what you need to do. The reason that this plague has come is because they need to do tshuva. They have to repent, and they haven't done it yet. Okay. So please save them. So I don't think that's the difference. Okay. I'm going to say what I see. The difference that I perceive is very much connected to that first chassidic story. In the biblical story, Moses and Aaron use real incense. They take incense, they put it on a pan. Aaron stands there, and the incense, with its smoke, stops the plague, stops the angel of death in his tracks. In the Rav Acha Zohar story, there is no incense. We don't have the incense anymore. Back to the Hasidic story. When the Baal Shem Tov used to go into the forest, he knew how to do everything, and he lit a fire, and he knew how to meditate, and he knew how to pray, and he knew where to do it. He knew all of the practical details. And then as that story kept on going, we lost one detail after another until all we were left with was the story. In Rav Acha's time, there is no incense. There's only telling the story of the incense. There's only talking about what the Torah gives us as information about incense. But it's not the incense itself. And that has to be enough. That's sufficient, as the story tells us. So, just for the last few minutes that we have together, now we come down to the crucial question, which is, what's the deal with the incense? Is this just some kind of like mumbo jumbo? Is this some kind of ancient, primitive, sense of magic? So of course the answer is yes, it is. But even magic, and even the word primitive has the word prime in it. It touches into some very primal and some very, very basic kinds of issues. So let's return now to the question of why should incense be so effective? And in order to answer that, we have to tell another story. So the story is from the Talmud, and it tells the story of Moses first receiving the Torah from God. And I'm going to read through it somewhat quickly. There's a lot in here, but I want to get to the punchline. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi also said, when Moses ascended on high, the ministering angels spoke before the Holy Blessed One and said, Sovereign of the universe, what business has one born of woman amongst us? What a put down, right? The human being born of a woman, God. So I'm saying that facetiously, but Yelod Isha, a mortal person, what is he doing up in heaven with the angels? What right does he have to be here? He has come to receive the Torah, God answered them. So the angels replied, What? That secret treasure that has been hidden with you for 974 generations before the world was created, now you want to give it to flesh and blood? So God turned to Moses and said, can you answer them? Can you respond to their claim? And Moses said to God, Sovereign of the universe, I am afraid. I'm afraid that they will consume me with their fire. And God answered to Moses, okay, hold on to my throne of glory, and that will protect you. Now give them an answer. So Moses turned to them, and he said, Sovereign of the universe, the Torah which you give me, what is written in it? It says, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. And then he turned to the angels and said, did you go down to Egypt? Were you enslaved to Pharaoh? Why then should the Torah be yours? Again, what is written there? You shall have no other gods before me. Do you dwell among peoples, you angels? Do you dwell among peoples who engage in idol worship? And it says also, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Do you angels work so that you need a Sabbath day to rest? And so on. He kept on bringing these proofs. And finally, he said, do you murder? Do you steal? Do you do all of the awful things that human beings do that the Torah tells them to refrain from? Do you need a Torah to stop you from doing these things? Straight away, they conceded to the Holy Blessed One and admitted that what God had decided was correct. And then, at the last moment before the Torah was given to Moses with the angel's assent, the angel of death also joined in. And he went to Moses and he shared with Moses a special secret. And he told him, if ever you need to confront me and stop my murderous plague, the way to do it is with incense. Burn the incense before me, and you will chase me away. And that is how Moses knew that the incense would stop the plague. For had the angel of death himself not told Moses, how could Moses have ever known? That's the end of that story. So what the Talmud is saying is that in this tug of war between God, Moses, and the angels, the way that we end up winning the Torah is by pointing out to the angels that we have a very different life story than they do. And the Torah that we have is attuned to the kind of stories that we live and that we embody and that we tell in our living, in our lives. We're the ones that kill and are killed. We're the ones that do all of the terrible things that bring about pain and suffering to each other. And so we need a Torah that can take us out of our bondage, physical and spiritual, and that can hopefully give us some kind of guidance and clues about how to live a better life. And then the angel of death gives this secret recipe, or this secret hint to Moses. This is my weak spot. Use the incense if you need to stop me. Well, now we know how Moses knew, because the story in the Torah doesn't have God telling Moses, to put incense on the pan. Moses comes up with this idea, just like Rav Acha came up with the idea. Rav Acha knew about it because of Moses. Moses knew about it because of the angel of death. Why does it work against the angel of death? So I want to add one last thing in the couple of minutes that we have left. And this is one more teaching from the Talmud. Rabbi Acha bar Bizna said in the name of Rav Chisda, the pious one, a fast in which none of the sinners of Israel participate is no fast. So he says when there is trouble in society, in the country, in the world, and the whole tractate of Tanit, which we were fortunate enough to recently conclude studying over so many years, is about the idea of convening a fast, a communal day of prayer and fasting to try to mitigate or avert a disaster. So this sage says, when we collect together as a community, you cannot exclude anyone. You may think that certain people in the community that you know of are the lowest of the low. You may have such a clear judgment about who they are. They are the sinners of Israel. They're the worst of the worst. If they join with you, you cannot kick them out. In fact, you need them to be there. If they are not there, then God will not listen to your prayers. On Kol Nidre night, as we begin the holiest, most awesome day of the year, we say, B'yeshiva shel malo v'yeshiva shel mata, anu matirin litpalel im ha'avaryanim. With the authorization of the divine court and the earthly court, we hereby declare that it is permitted for all of us to pray together as sinners. Every single person is welcome, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done, no matter what they believe, no matter what they think. Everybody must be included. How do we know this? Says this sage. He says, we know it from the incense. For behold, the odor of galbanum, chelbana, is very unpleasant, and yet it was included among the spices of the incense. So he says, when you look in the recipe for how to make incense for the temple, the text that Rabbi Acha said we should read when we want to stop the plague, the recipe is all these wonderful, amazing, aromatic herbs that are all brought together. But one of them, chelbana, whatever that is, galbanum, I don't know what it is, actually stinks. It has a very bad odor. And yet it's mixed in with all of the other stuff that has wonderful, delicious odors. And that's the only way that the incense is legitimate incense. So the incense represents us in all of our imperfections. And it represents the compassionate gesture of saying, you know what? Take us or leave us. We are who we are. And we've got all of those flaws and all of those dark sides. And that's why the Torah was given to us. You gave us a Torah because of that. It has in it the 10 Commandments. That's not for angels. It's for us. So the incense is a kind of a embodiment of the totality, the multiplicity, the plurality of all of our souls, of all of our personalities, and of all of our stories, mixing them together in one sweet smelling aroma for God to be able to accept and to be able to embrace and to enable to bless us. So until next time, thank you to everyone for joining, and we'll have a different story next time. If you have any comments or any suggestions, send me an email, please. This is a work in progress, and we can always try to do it as best as we can.
I looked into it.
So, thank you.
You can
Thank you,
blur it.
Rabbi.
Thank
All
you.
right. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right. Signing
Night.
off.
Thank you.
I couldn't on my Zoom for some reason.
Danny's work easier.
I thought you just had to hit something to unmute. I mean, I didn't know you needed that thing. Well, you said our microphone doesn't work.
Well, no, but I think it didn't work because I had it silenced by them. But this is still flashing. I don't know what the story is.
No, okay, you're still, and now you're still not answering my question. Okay, so now